Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another poetry discussion. Real quick before we get into that, if you enjoy what I do here, trying to spread the word of literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel. Poetry, short stories, novel read-alongs, sometimes writing. Consider hitting the like button because it lets YouTube know to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more. Last thing before we get into it, there is a link to my personal channel to be found in the description below. On my personal channel, I talk about philosophy, movies, general sort of internet stuff, things like that. I'm really trying to grow that channel. I am currently 42 subscribers away from 1,000. So if you enjoy anything that I say here, maybe consider going over there and subscribing there as well. We have here another poetry discussion for Charles Bukowski. This is, of course, National Poetry Month, where I will have 30 poetry discussions in 30 days on the channel. And Saturdays are with Bukowski. This poem is one with which I was not familiar. 100% transparency. What I did was I asked one of these GPT type services, what are the most popular Bukowski poems or what are the most important Bukowski poems? I can't remember exactly how I worded it, but I got a list of replies and decided to yank a few of them out. And those were the poetry discussions for Charles Bukowski that I put into National Poetry Month this year. In the Shadow of the Rose was a poem I had not heard of. Apparently, it is the titular poem, pardon me, in a short print Bukowski run, which was done shortly before his death. I believe 1991. I believe Bukowski died in 93. So we have end of life poetry, not quite a death poem, a Jisai, Jisei poem, which are also very interesting, a very interesting sort of practice. If you have not heard of Jisai, I have no idea how it's actually pronounced. I'm going to be 100% honest. I just have a book of them. But a death poem, if you will. So here, in the Shadow of the Rose, it reads as such. Branching out, grubbing down, taking stairways down to hell, reestablishing the vanishing point, trying a different bat, a different stance, altering diet and manner of walking, readjusting the system, photographing your dinosaur dream, driving your machine with more grace and care, noticing the flowers talking to you, realizing the gigantic agony of the terrapin. You pray for rain like an Indian, slide a fresh clip into the automatic, turn out the lights, and wait. So this is a different type of Bukowski poem, in my opinion. This is so starting just with the title. A lot of times, I think one of the things that keeps Bukowski from being maybe not a better known poet, but a more treasured poet among sort of poetry lovers as opposed to Bukowski lovers, because I think there's really less overlap there than would necessarily be the case. I think that there are more people who treasure Bukowski and maybe not the greater body of poetry, and people who treasure the greater body of poetry that don't consider Bukowski a poet. They're wrong, but I think that there is a sharp chasm between the two. And part of that comes from the fact that, well, a lot of it comes from the crass nature of some of the things that Bukowski wrote about, but those are authentic. You would think that would be treasured by people who actually treasure poetry, but it's not. The question of titles. Oftentimes in Bukowski poetry, I'm not going to say they're throwaway, but they're maybe not necessary. And the titles, if Bukowski had better titles, now I know my favorite poet is Emily Dickinson, so I'm sort of um, I'm not talking my book here, right? I'm sort of being counterintuitive to the other things that I talk about. But I think that Bukowski's titles not being necessitated by the poem, if you will, oftentimes, not giving us a deeper insight into the poem, oftentimes, is something that keeps him largely on the outside of the poetry lovers sort of circle. And I don't think Bukowski would want to be in that circle. I think it's very possible Bukowski would be 100% all right not being in that circle. But here in this poem, I think the title is necessary. I think the title gives us a great insight into the poem because it's sort of a scattered thing going on here, branching out, grubbing down, taking stairways down to hell, reestablishing the vanishing point, trying a different bat, a different stance, altering diet and manner of walking, readjusting the system, photographing your dinosaur dream, driving your machine with more grace and care. This seems to be a turning point in the poem. From here up, branching out, grubbing down, taking stairways down to hell, reestablishing the vanishing point, trying a different bat, a different stance, altering diet and manner of walking, readjusting the system, photographing your dinosaur dream. This is all sort of negative imagery. Branching out, why? Because what you're doing isn't working. Grubbing down, if I'm understanding this right, grubbing down, eating. When you get to the point where eating becomes grubbing down, it's because you're very, very hungry. Taking stairways down to hell, that doesn't sound positive at all. Reestablishing the vanishing point. Why would you have to reestablish the vanishing point? Because you've lost your sense of direction. Trying a different bat because you're not getting hits. A different stance because you're not getting hits. Altering diet and manner of walking because you find yourself slouching down. Readjusting the system. If you're having to readjust the system isn't working for you. Photographing your dinosaur dream. Okay, I'm not 100% sure there. I'm not 100% sure there. But from that point on, driving your machine with more grace and care, noticing the flowers talking to you, realizing the gigantic agony of the terrapin. You pray for rain like an Indian, slide a fresh... so here, we turn positive. At least we turn compassionate, driving your machine with more grace and care. Not being a jerk on the roadways, noticing the flowers talking to you, nature presenting itself to you. It's there for you to enjoy. You don't have to, but why wouldn't you? Realizing the gigantic agony of the terrapin. Sort of hippie-ish, I suppose, but it's definitely compassionate. You pray for rain like an Indian. You would only pray for rain if you thought that prayer might do good. And then we get right back to slide a fresh clip into the automatic. Okay, that's a harbinger of doom. You're certainly preparing for something. Turn out the lights and wait. Waiting with a fully loaded automatic. Okay, we're preparing for something negative again. In the shadow of the rose. Oh, I don't know how I did that. I have never done that before. There we go. In the shadow of the rose. What is the rose? Bukowski often goes on with the rose as being the most beautiful, the most fragrant, the most attractive. The rose is pinnacle. The rose is goodness. But in the same way that we maybe have the cliche, every rose has its thorns, every rose has its shadow. The thorns would be the obvious danger. The thorns would be the obvious downside. The thorns would be the obvious negative to the positive. But what is the shadow? The shadow is the darkness, and darkness only hurts you moment by moment. The darkness doesn't prick you, does not make you bleed. The darkness slowly grows, like day into night. The darkness overwhelms moment by moment before suddenly, and you hadn't noticed it, you've spent too much time in the darkness. But you hadn't noticed it, and maybe you're lost. So here we have darkness, and I'm only including photographing your dinosaur dream because it sounds like your dream is extinct and you're trying to hold on to pieces of it, but not real sure. We have the darkness, we have the rose, and then we have another shadow. So, what is going on here, I think, is this sort of subliminal explanation of how it is that the darkness overwhelms you. Not not the thorns. The thorns are obvious. You can throw your life away on the thorns and be completely cognizant of it the whole while. But with the darkness, by the time you realize it is too much, it was too long, there may be no turning back. Is that what it is that Bukowski is getting at here? This was, like I say, an end-of-life poem for Bukowski. Bukowski, however, so if you read enough Bukowski, you realize that Bukowski thought he was dying the entire time he was alive. So I'm not sure if there were sudden changes that would have made him more cognizant of the darkness overwhelming him, of the end that was coming to him. So what I'm saying is, I don't know that it is necessary to overweight the date of this poem being 2 years or less before he actually passed. But I had not heard of this poem. It's, again, the titular poem in a collection that was a short run, um, which is interesting. Definitely interesting. And it is, you hear a lot of stories about authors' lives. And Mark Twain, I think, died basically broke. Mark Twain died an old man, but he said, golly, I want to say he thought that a writer had done his best writing by the time he was 28, I believe was the quote from Mark Twain. So, I mean, don't hold me to that quote, but something like that. Something ridiculously early, whereas Twain lived ridiculously long. So, these writers' ideas on death and their attitudes towards life are something that inevitably bleeds into their work. When you look at Hemingway's writing and his live fast and die hard sort of attitude, it comes through in his writing. Very, very, there's a lot of bravado, very tough, right? Very rawhide and beef jerky in Hemingway. Bukowski, much of Bukowski's poetry is sort of like the slow drip of cyanide being put into your rehydration bag straight into your bloodstream. Drip, drip, drip. That is how it reads to me anyway. There is always, I won't say that the idea of death is always present, but the specter of death is always present. And I think these things are different. I think that in Bukowski and here as well, the idea of death as, or the darkness as an inevitability, and the idea that death is just one end of the spectrum of darkness. You've got the whole range here. If you have the idea of darkness, darkness takes over here, death is here. So there's a little bit of darkness in all of Bukowski's poems. So the specter of death is ever present, but not necessarily the actual idea of death. So it is strange for me to see a Bukowski poem where the title is so important. And without that title, I don't know what I would have made of this poem. I don't know that I would have made anything of this poem. It may have been that confusing for me. And again, a little bit of imagism here from Bukowski that I don't think is necessarily so. Bukowski certainly wrote by the objective correlative, not in ideas, but things. Bukowski's not going to come out to you and say, I am a nihilist and so XYZ. No. Bukowski just paints the picture. But normally, Bukowski paints the picture in actual moments as opposed to uh, realizing the gigantic agony of the terrapin, noticing the flowers talking to you. Normally, he just gives you the whole picture, the actual thing itself. But that is all I have for this poetry discussion. A poetry discussion of In the Shadow of the Rose by Charles Bukowski. Again, this is National Poetry Month, so there will be a poetry discussion every day on this channel. But outside of this month, there is poetry every Monday on Strip Coverlet, and I hope to have you back for the next one.